I'd like to welcome everyone to the historic Mexican and Mexican-American Press debut event. We're thrilled to have so many people join us tonight. My name is Chris Cullen. I'm the data curation librarian on the scholarly publishing and data management team and the project manager for the collection. I'd like to recognize the other project members. Mary Feeney, she's the journalism librarian on the research services team. Veronica Reyes Escudero, the Borderlands curator librarian on the special collections team, and Yen Han, systems librarian on the scholarly publishing and data management team. Before we proceed, I'd like to provide a bit of context about the project. The historic Mexican and Mexican-American Press collection documents and showcases 150 years of historic Mexican and Mexican-American publications published in Tucson, El Paso, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sonora, Mexico, from the mid-1800s to the 1970s, documenting the voice of Mexican and the Mexican-American community. This comprehensive collection covers important periods in Mexican-American history, ranging from the Mexican Revolution to the Bracero program to the Chicano movement. A few years ago, Dr. Roberto Cintley Rodriguez of the Mexican-American Studies and Research Center was teaching a course called The History of Red-Brown Journalism and Communication. The course examined early civil and human rights struggles from the 19th and 20th century and Mexican-American journalism in the United States. Mary, Veronica, and I were all involved in working with the class as they researched various sources in both the main library and special collections. In addition to writing research papers, the students developed an exhibit in the main library where they shared their research with the U of A and the broader community on the history of journalism and communication of Latino and indigenous populations. Some of the materials they found we thought others would be interested in, and so the idea for the project was born. You may be wondering, how unique is this collection? The National Digital Newspaper Program digitized newspapers from across the country. However, until recently, these newspapers have only been English language newspapers. In 2011, the program started accepting proposals for newspapers in other languages, including Spanish. There are a few other exceptions, including a commercial database and a couple of individual newspaper titles. Mary has compiled a list of sources that will be available at the reception. Other issues we discovered while working on the project: some of the Mexican and Mexican-American newspapers are not widely available in print. There's gaps in coverage, and some were published for only a few years. The U of A library saw a real need to provide public access to these newspapers and magazines to encourage discovery and scholarship by students, researchers, and community members. In addition, the materials within the collection can be easily searched in our archive for long-term digital preservation. Carla Stoffel, Dean of the University of Arizona Libraries, has made it possible for the U of A libraries to think strategically and provide funding for projects such as this one. She's been a champion of furthering access to unique materials, especially within Borderlands studies. I'd like to welcome Dean Stoffel, who will be providing the official welcome and additional remarks.
Thank you, and it's great to see so many of you here tonight. I want to thank you for joining us in celebrating the digital debut of the historic Mexican and Mexican-American Press collection. Frankly, this evening, and you all being here, sort of provides a nice sort of ending as I get ready to step down. When I came, I wanted to be much more open to our community and to bring more of our community in and various members of our community to enjoy our special collections. Your history, I felt when I first came here, has been underrepresented. Tonight, and the effort of this collection sort of brings me to a point where I feel a great deal of pride in this being available and you being here, and we know going forward that this collection will provide not only our researchers and our students, who are of course very important to us, but they will provide you, our community, with prolonged access to these collections, but also to your history. So this is a special moment for me and a moment of great pride in our staff. I'd like to take a few moments before I turn this over to what you really came here for, to recognize and extend our gratitude to the folks that made tonight possible. Obviously, I need to thank Chris Collin, Mary Feeney, Veronica Reyes, and Jan Hahn, who I think are here. So let them stand up. You may have already seen them, but you can never. You can never say thank you too much. I would also like to thank Gina Bowden, who's organized tonight's event, and when the refreshments arrive, she will have been responsible for that, and we will have an enjoyable evening here. I'd also like to thank Gabrielle Sykes-Casavat and Marty Taylor, who helped provide the publicity and the graphics for this. I know that Gabrielle's here. I don't know if Marty's here. Gabrielle's in the back. I see that my old friend, and I shouldn't say that, I should say my good friend, Jacqueline Sharkey, is here. She's Professor Emerita and former Director of the School of Journalism. I'd like Jackie to stand up because her contributions have been invaluable. Now, we couldn't be here tonight without the people who actually did the work in editing, publishing, making available copies from their family collections, the materials that we have. And so I would like the families to please stand and be recognized for the wonderful things you've given to the University of Arizona and therefore allowed us to share with the community. So would you please stand? Come on. Come on. Come on. There's going to be another program on Monday evening, our Civil Rights in Arizona lecture series. And I hope that you'll have so much fun tonight that you'll come back and participate in that last event for this school year. Now I need to turn this over to Veronica Reyes, who will introduce our distinguished guest, and thank you again for being here tonight.
Forgive me, and I'll keep my remarks as brief as possible. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Les agradecemos que hayan tomado el tiempo para estar con nosotros en este importante lanzamiento de la Hemeroteca de Prensa México-Americana. Tenemos el placer de tener con nosotros, además de los panelistas aquí a mi izquierda, a nuestros invitados distinguidos. Es mi honor presentarles al Consul Calderón Jaimes, señor Alberto Elías y el señor Arturo Moreno. Consul Juan Manuel Calderón Jaimes es reconocido por sus distinguidos esfuerzos dentro de la comunidad como la importante ventanilla de salud en colaboración con el Rio Community Health Center. Además, han aportado eventos culturales y educativos donde se encuentran oportunidades de mejorar el entendimiento y aprendizaje de la cultura fronteriza. Le agradezco mucho su participación esta tarde. I'd like to thank Consul Calderón Jaimes, who has been a great supporter of events in special collections. I mentioned that Consul Jaimes has been known for his very proactive work in the community, serving as a model for other consulates around the country. They've not only collaborated with organizations like El Rio Community Health Center, but he's been a great supporter of cultural and educational events that push forward a greater understanding of our borderlands communities. So it is an honor to have him and his staff here in support of this collection and event, and we are grateful for his participation at tonight's event. El Tucsonense was founded by Francisco Santos Moreno in one of the longest-running Spanish-language newspaper in Tucson, having been printed from 1915 to 1959, and we all know about El Fronterizo as well. It is included in the collection, and we consider it one of the cornerstone newspapers in the collection, not only for its long print run, but for its coverage of issues during a time of great change in Tucson. When we came upon it, when the project team came upon it as a possibility for the collection, our eyes lit up immediately as we understood the magnitude of what having the collection or the newspaper digitized would do in terms of preserving the newspaper, providing access to it, and ensuring that it would become and remain part of the historical record. As we sought permission to digitize the newspaper and make it accessible, we got very excited, and I'd want to thank Bob Diaz for facilitating that initial meeting with the Elias family. He's been a long friend of the Eliases from when they were little, and so I really appreciate his being able to facilitate that first initial meeting at formal sort of lunch at Lindita. I very much appreciated that, the conversations we had, and I'm grateful that we could continue that relationship. Sorry. I've had shared and have had many lunches with Mr. Elias since, and I look forward to many more. Our talks have given me great insight into the contributions of his and the Moreno family, as well as the many contributions of many of you in the audience tonight. We are so grateful also to Mr. Moreno for taking the time away from his very busy bi-state responsibilities and schedule to be here with us. Mr. Moreno, like Mr. Elias, were grandsons to Francisco Moreno, and although at different times they both spent time in the print shop alongside El Tucsonense. So they're going to say a few words about their time there. So I'm going to go ahead and have Consul Jaimes Calderón, or Calderón Jaimes, up, and then Mr. Moreno and Mr. Elias will follow and say a few remarks, and after which we'll follow with our panelists. Thank you.
Con la mano, ¿verdad? Vamos a utilizar la mano. Muchas gracias a todos. Muy buenas noches. Me es muy grato para su servidor estar aquí. Hoy me siento como en casa porque veo en sus rostros y en el mío un encuentro del mestizaje de México y Estados Unidos. Siento la calidez y la cercanía con mi país. Quiero agradecer a la Universidad de Arizona por darme esta oportunidad y este tiempo por invitarme. Como saben, los periodistas construyen sus reputaciones y carreras hablando de otras personas. Se les exige que expresen en sus palabras lo que sucede a nuestro alrededor. Son aquellos periodistas exitosos los que cuentan historias sin agrandarlas, sin conducirlas, sin tratar de probar nada, siendo sensibles administradores del tiempo y labradores de experiencias, hombres y mujeres de buena madera. Son aquellos seres humanos que con sus palabras formulan enseñanzas y comunican realidades. Comunicar la realidad promueve la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas de los gobernantes, evita las explicaciones mágicas, los cálculos falsos y acota el deporte de la teoría de la conspiración. Creo firmemente que en esta colección encontramos la realidad en pequeñas piezas que permanecerán en el tiempo, recordándonos a los mexicanos y a los mexicoamericanos. Antes de la historia existe el periodismo. Muchos de estos reportajes sobre la población latina en Arizona, en Chicago, en Texas, California, se han convertido en libros con nuestra memoria, nuestra historia. Por ejemplo, mi letra no es en inglés. Ensayo de poesía escrita por Manuel Murrieta Saldívar, profesor de la de la California State University Stanislaus, que evidencia como las páginas del Tucsonense se nutrió de la tradición literaria ibérica y mexicana utilizando la poesía. Aquí, si ustedes me permiten, me gustaría dar lectura a una persona que escribió, Manuel F. Guerra, dedicado al Tucsonense, y dice así, dos párrafos, dice: todos debemos leer, todos debemos pensar, teniendo en cuenta que existe también un bisemanal. Son palabras que escribieron en 1941 por el señor y poeta Manuel F. Guerra, dedicado al Tucsonense. Es lo que vamos a encontrar en esta colección. Hoy, gracias a la tecnología, esta colección no será exclusiva de los investigadores, porque a veces monopolizan este tipo de información, y estará disponible para todos nosotros. Lo que hará los que vivimos es apasionante, porque las posibilidades de comunicación son prácticamente inmediatas y múltiples. Podemos consultar el periódico El Fronterizo, fundado en 1878 por Carlos Velasco, también conocido como la Conciencia de la Comunidad Mexicana, desde 1870 hasta su muerte en 1940. Lo que dura poco es despreciable. También hay cosas que duran mucho que no son significativas, sino le encontramos sentido desde el inicio. Conservar la historia de lucha por tener un país mejor, por aliviar la pobreza, por vivir en democracia y mejorar la calidad de vida, siempre será la máxima expresión de nuestra humanidad, de nuestra libertad y nuestro poder en servidumbre. Quiero agradecer, como siempre lo he hecho, a la Universidad de Arizona en sus diferentes áreas por haberme dado la oportunidad de estar presente en diversas manifestaciones culturales, académicas. Hoy me gustaría anunciar a muchos de los amigos que se encuentran aquí que prácticamente 9 años de haber vivido aquí en Tucson y haber sido amigo de la universidad, y saber que la presidenta de la universidad a finales de próxima semana visita la Ciudad de México entrevistándose con autoridades académicas, pues es para mí una realidad. Concluir mi término como cónsul de México y decirlo ante la Universidad de Arizona es un honor, y más presentando esta colección que nos va a permitir a todos los que viven aquí y los que hemos vivido y los que vamos a regresar aquí a Tucson, porque es una ciudad maravillosa, con la Universidad de Arizona, que le da un sentido de democracia, un sentido donde la gente puede decir lo que piensa. Solamente me resta decirles muchísimas gracias por haber dado oportunidad al consulado y al cónsul de México estar presente en este tipo de eventos. Y por supuesto a mis amigos, los señores Elías, que siempre estuvieron en estos momentos que dábamos información a nuestra comunidad. Muchísimas gracias.
Artie and I are going to take this job on and try and do justice to it, and we're going to do it together in some form, some fashion. But first of all, I want to thank the University of Arizona for hosting this event, and I'm kind of taken back by the number of people that showed up tonight. Really a fantastic bunch.
Relatives. They're relatives.
Artie says that it's probably because we have such a large family and so many relatives. Well, that might be true, but we also have a lot of friends with all those relatives, and I'm really impressed. What do you think, Artie?
I think it's great.
That's great. Anyway, the special collections, can't hear? The Special Collections Library has done a great job in taking this collection on and digitizing it and making it available to anyone who comes on their website and wants to find anything that was taking place in Tucson, just simply by going to the computer electronically, you can connect to the website and get any information that you want on any newspaper of El Tucsonense that was published all the way from 1915 all the way up until its finality. But that is just a preface. What I want to say to all of you is that I want to tell you as much as possible about Francisco Moreno, who was the founder of El Tucsonense, and his wife, Rosa Elias Moreno. And if I don't say it today, at the age of 84, I might never have an opportunity to be here again to say it to anyone. So I need to do this for my own personal benefit, if for nothing, no other reason. And I'm so glad that Arte is here to give me support, because he's going to have to hold me up here. Even though Arte and I belong to the same generation, there's quite a gap in age, and he's a much younger group than I am. So that Arte has seen a lot of this as well as I have. But I need to give you all of what I'm going to say, because I can go back and remember the first conversations I ever had about El Tucsonense with my grandmother, Rosa Elias Moreno. And those conversations were taking place when I was a little kid, and she told me about her husband, Francisco. I never knew Francisco because he died immediately after I was born. I was born in 1929, and he died 2 months later. So I never knew my grandfather. Nevertheless, I could connect with him because my grandmother would take me aside and we'd sit down and we'd talk. I'd listen. She'd do the talking. But it was really nice because she clued me in on a lot of stuff that might be lost in history. So she really did a great job. And I can remember her telling me that Francisco came to Tucson as a young kid, 6 years old. He was brought here by his grandmother because his mother had died just previous to coming here. And his grandmother had some family members here in Tucson, so she came here. And Francisco Moreno was very privileged and had occasion to be able to go to public schools in the United States. It wasn't the United States yet. It was the very beginning of the state of Arizona. And at 6 years of age, it was quite a stretch for him to begin school. But he went through all the public school system. And he was very fortunate in that he met a person named Carlos Tully. Carlos Tully was a teacher in the public school that he had gone to, and Carlos Tully was also a printer and a publisher of the Tucson Citizen at that time. So Carlos kind of took Francisco under his wing and took him into the composing room, and he made a printer out of him. And Francisco took off from there, and it was 1915 before he could start his own newspaper, but he started his own newspaper, El Tucsonense, in 1915. He was already married. He already had some of his children beginning to grow up. Nevertheless, I'm sure it was a very difficult time for him. However, my grandmother always said we always survived, and there was never any doubt that we were going to be in good shape. 5 years after he started El Tucsonense, he was printing the newspaper outside of another print shop, because he did not have the funds or the money to have a print shop of his own. So he was printing his newspaper at a print shop outside. But 5 years later, he had been able to accumulate a sufficient amount of money to be able to buy his equipment and to begin a building. As a matter of fact, the building that I am in right now at Old Pueblo Printers is a building that he built. And he did that in a short period of time. It gives you a feeling of the effort that people were putting into their work during that period of time, and how success was in their mind and they wanted to move forward. Well, I think Francisco was one of these men, and he really was a go-getter. Francisco had a Tucsonense, and I have to read to you some of the important subjects that were covered in his Tucsonense. There was little mention of it a short time ago, but he covered the Mexican Revolution. He covered Mexican labor in Arizona, the Depression from 1929 on through the 30s. He covered discrimination and institutionalized subordination of the Mexicanos. He covered the Mexicans that were in the public school system and the problems that were being handled by everybody. There was a lot of Mexican politics in the 20s and 30s that he covered, and he covered it pretty well. He also covered the mistreatment of farm workers, the Mexican railroad workers that were imported here to build a railroad, and the treatment that they received. He wrote about sports, he wrote about arts, and he covered World War II or World War I completely. All of this in Spanish, and he covered World War II just as well. So, you know, he did a great job. Anyway, by the time Francisco had reached the point where he had a going newspaper, and during the latter part of his life, nearing his 50 years old, the community was calling him the defensor de la raza. And you translate that into English, and they say he was the defender of the people. That was his title. And I think he must have earned it. And it makes me very proud to be here and say that. The next thing that I have here is that in this period of about at the end of the 30s, the beginning of 1940, he needed an editor. He had an editor, but he had resigned, and it came time to get a new editor, so he went out hunting for one, and he found a very special person that entered the picture, and his name was Ricardo Fierro. He was always prepared, and he wrote all kinds of good material and covered all kinds of events for El Tucsonense, and he had a great knowledge of English, and he had a perfect knowledge of Spanish. And I kind of neglected Artie up until now, you know, but this was Artie's grandfather, and he was my grandfather too. But Artie has a special connection to Mr. Fierro.
Well, that's my mom's father, so it's my Grandpa Piero. But when I was a young boy, I went to, my first schooling was at Immaculate Heart Academy, which is downtown, about 2 blocks away from the shop. And after school, I would walk over to the shop to wait for my dad to get off. And most of the time, I'd sit there with my grandfather. And my grandfather was always in a 3-piece suit, always very well groomed, always had a cigarette holder and cigarette somewhere around. But he would take me for these long walks, and I spent a lot of time around the shop, and probably talk a little bit about that. How are we going to try to do it chronological order? But Grandpa Piero was really great to our family. He was closer to you, or to you? I'm sorry.
To me, of course.
Right. Anyways, I was telling my brothers and sisters earlier that it was sort of like going on a field trip here the last few weeks, trying to put some thoughts together about being a young boy and going to the shop and seeing my dad working and how busy it was, and my grandfather, what was going on in Tucson. And do you want to keep moving?
Yeah,
Or do you want me to talk about? Okay, all right. Anyways, so I didn't write a very long thing, but the first thing is, on behalf of the Elias and the Moreno family, I would really like to thank everybody involved with this project. I think it's a tremendous thing. And, thank you for continuing the tradition of the El Tucsonense and all of the Mexican-American newspapers. Preserving this culture for future generations is a very important historical effort. I used to go down to the shop, and at first I was a little kid just hanging around, and after a while, much like Albert and my uncles, they started making me do chores and started running around sweeping and cleaning and doing all the stuff. But I really got a great education of downtown Tucson. As time went by, I learned to set type, and my dad always would save the headline for me to put in. I wasn't a very good speller, so he had to give me copy. So, but anyways, the big block headliner, he just said, "Okay, you get ready," and then taught me how to space it out, whatever. But over a period of time, I learned a lot of the presses, the equipment, and then later I went on to Tucson High, and they put me in print shop there, so I learned to print and help with the paper and learned to print all different kinds of things. So, anyways, after high school, much like Albert, went in the Army for a couple years, did a tour in Vietnam, and then came back and graduated from the University of Arizona. The right colors, right? But anyway, I'm going to finish up my talk, I guess. Anyway, so I would like to thank my cousin Albert and his family for safeguarding the family traditions and all the archives. And thank everybody for coming. Thank you. Did I mumble too much?
No, you were fine. You don't mumble.
Yeah.
I mumble.
Yeah.
I want to go back to where I was at. And I want to give you a picture of this Moreno family. Francisco and Rosa, we've already talked about them. But then there were five children. Hermelinda, who was my mother, and she married Alberto Elías, and her family was my sister Aida and me. But in addition to that, Francisco and Rosa also had 4 other children: Gilberto, Arturo, Federico, and Elias. Each one of them became a very important part of El Tucsonense also, because each one of them worked at the print shop, with the exception of my mom. She never got to work. She was so fortunate, never had to get her hands dirty with ink, But she was always there with support, and she told us what to do when we needed to be told. But I was going to say that the first son was Gilberto Moreno, and he married Amalia Wood, also a Tucsonan, and they had 2 daughters. Edna, who happens to be here in Tucson today. Edna, stand up. And her sister, who is named Mia, and she is in Puerto Vallarta, in Manzanillo, and has a bed and breakfast down there. But the important part is that the mom and dad of these girls settled in San Diego after their father had been running the print shop. After Francisco died, Gilberto became the manager of the print shop. He stayed as manager for something like 7 or 8 years. Then they moved, and they finally wound up in San Diego. And they lived there the balance of their life, and the daughters have continued to live there. I just wanted to say that Gilberto left Tucson but never left the printing trade. He always made a living at printing. And when he did get to San Diego, he probably worked for one of the best newspapers on the West Coast. And I mean better newspapers than the Times in Los Angeles and some of those. He worked for the San Diego Tribune and the San Diego Union both, and they were great newspapers. We'll go to the next son, who was Elias. Elias was the youngest son, and he became manager of El Tucsonense about 1936. He did a good job. However, he thought, well, he had a little bit of politics in his veins, I think, because he decided he wanted to run for office, and he ran for a city council seat. He wanted to be a councilman, and this was in 1939. Sad to say, but on election day, he turned himself into St. Mary's Hospital, and he passed away the following morning, having suffered from an appendectomy, and the result was peritonitis, and he was never elected. He lost his election, but he lost his life in trying to get into politics. It's an interesting fact, you know. And I say these things because they're real things, and those are things that many people in every family suffer through. And then the following son was Federico Moreno. He managed El Tucsonense also from 1939, possibly to about 1942, 1943. Fred was married to Lupe Mills, and they had 4 boys: Freddie, Richard, Eugene, and Tommy. Freddie passed away several years ago. His wife Patricia is here. Patricia, where are you? Stand up. Great. And Richard, he's here too. Where are you, Richard? Stand up. We all know him as Dickie, but it's Richard Moreno. And he has his brother Eugene, who is not here, but his other brother Tommy is here. Where are you, Thomas? Over here. Stand. So Fred was also an expert linotype operator, as a matter of fact. And he continued working at the print shop even after having been manager. And he also managed the circulation department. And then he managed one other thing. Federico had a second love, the love of his life, and the second love was baseball. He had a baseball team named Los Aztecas, and they were known all over the Southwest. They played in Tucson consistently. I saw them play at High Corbett Field. I saw them play at Riverside Park. A dirt lot is what it was, but it was called Riverside Park. I saw him play in Hermosillo. I saw him play in Cananea. I saw him play in Nogales. I saw him play in Douglas. He was all over the Southwest with his Los Aztecas. And I think it was just this love of baseball that he had, and he couldn't drop it. And to the day that he died, I'm sure that baseball was his greatest hobby. And we'll go on to the next man. The next brother was Arturo. Arturo moved into the manager's place probably about 1942, and he continued to print and operate El Tucsonense until its final edition was printed, and that was sometime in 1960. Arturo was married to Mary Fierro Connor and became Moreno, and she brought up 11 children, and this is just one of them. She had a daughter, Andriette, who passed away early. Artie, Rosemary, Linda, Elias, Bobby, Joanne, Ellen, Alex, Ronnie, and Patty, who has just passed away just this first part of the year. Would the other Moreno family members please stand? Come on, Bobby and all of you. And Patty, may she rest in peace. Anyway, El Tucsonense published this last issue about 1960. The printing plant still continued, and in 1966, my grandmother sold the print shop to me. So I continued on together with a partner named Oscar Araiza, and we renamed it Old Pueblo Printers, and it's been in continuous operation for the last 46 years, and I'm still there. And Artie has a great appreciation about that print shop. He hasn't told you all of the dirty jobs that he used to do, but I think we ought to give him a chance to tell us
No, I think we're fine.
all of the tough jobs that he did. Because I did them too, you know. I had to take all the lead out to that little shack in the back and had to melt it and turn it into ingots and reuse it. And when I got through doing it, the very same lead was still there because it's recycled. So Artie was doing the same thing to the same lead, you know. It went on and on. And everything that I did, you did later, Artie, and that's the interesting part, is that this cycle never ends.
That's how smart we are.
That's how smart we are. Anyway, I want to thank all of my family and all of you that are here tonight for letting me and Artie be here and to speak with you. And Artie, I wish you could maybe end this with some special words for the rest of the people.
I already thought I gave my special words. But, I told Albert, and I was telling some of my family, and my wife was critiquing my spelling and my sentences. But whatever, it's been sort of like taking a field trip back. And I got on Googling Francisco and, old Tucson and what was going on and trying to put the pieces together. I tell my kids, I say, you kids have chips in your brains and I have card catalogs. So, trying to get the memory bank going and going back and reliving some of this thing. And, you should always remember the positive things. But, what you people have done is so special for the community, because now what we have is for life. We have, part of the roots of where we came from. We're both fourth generation minimum, wherever. And for generations to come, we get an opportunity to look back at what our forefathers did, etc. But thank you very much, and everybody, for coming. And it's a very special night. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you to Consul Calderón Jaimes for being here. It's an honor. And also thank you to Mr. Moreno and Mr. Elias. Your stories are just so wonderful. I'm sure we could listen to them all night. They're so wonderful. And thank you for sharing that and for all your support. My name's Mary Feeney, one of the librarians involved in the digital project. It's my honor to be able to introduce our panelists tonight. We have Roberto Cintley Rodriguez. He's an assistant professor in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. He's an award-winning journalist and was the publisher and editor of Americas 2001 and El Corazon de Aztlán, two of the magazines, you've probably seen the pictures up here on the screen, that are included in this digital collection. His research areas include the examination of maize culture, migration, and the role of stories and oral traditions among Mexican and Central American peoples. Celeste Gonzalez de Bustamante is an assistant professor in the School of Journalism, and she's also an affiliated faculty member at the Center for Latin American Studies. She's the author of Muy Buenas Noches, Mexico, Television, and the Cold War, and she's co-editor of an anthology about immigration, media, and globalization entitled Arizona Firestorm, Global Immigration Realities, National Media, and Provincial Politics. She's the current president of the Border Journalism Network, La Red de Periodistas de la Frontera, and is a former producer and reporter for KUAT, our local PBS affiliate, and numerous other network affiliates in California and Arizona. And we also have Guadalupe Castillo, who was co-editor of Coraje. Again, you probably saw pictures on the screen. That was published as a monthly newspaper in Tucson in 1969. The publisher was the Mexican American Liberation Committee, which had originated here at the University of Arizona. Ms. Castillo is a professor at Pima Community College. She's been a well-known advocate for social justice issues, and she is the recipient of the 2011 YWCA Lifetime Achievement Award. So please welcome our panelists to hear their stories.
Wali Newano Toka Sentot Lakatsin, or Dr. Simply, Tlasokamati Wedmiak, and thank you for permitting me to be here. I have a class that I teach. It's called The History of Red-Brown Journalism, and I see a couple of colleagues that kind of are part of that, so to speak. I don't know if Dr. Gonzalez is still here. She actually came up with that title. We were columnists for about, 15, 16, 17 years. But I remember she actually coined that term when we worked in Albuquerque. But in any case, I want to get to this PowerPoint in a second, but I just did want to recognize an old colleague, a friend of mine, Frank Sotomayor, who I actually knew him when I was in college, and that was a long time ago. But anyway, and he's a giant in our field, so if we can give him a hand, please. And the other person I wanted to recognize is my colleague here. Well, actually, both of them. I mean, I know they're all going to do their own talk, but Celeste Bustamante, she and several others, collaborate, you could say, in this class. I've had them as speakers. I know the special words I wanted to give is for Lupe, because that is, right now we're looking at history. Most of this Tucsonense, all these things are from way back. But what's impressive to me about Lupe is that some of you probably watched TV, right? A couple years ago, while we were in the midst of our battles, with MAS and the school board. I mean, she was one of our elders that was arrested that night. It was, to me, it was one of the most historic things I've ever witnessed. And for them to take her away, and I was proud. I was proud that it wasn't like I could say, oh, she used to do things. No, she still does things. She still stands up for her community. So thank you, Lupe. So this what I have here is actually produced by my students, and it was mentioned that we had an exhibit here. We had a newspaper. One of the newspapers we left, I think it's in the back over there somewhere. So you'll get to see. So all of this, but I have to say this. Well, let me just go through this, and you can see there's an image there of a couple of writers. They're called Tlacuilos. When I created this concept of this class, it was a little different. It's similar to what we're seeing here, but a little different, because in my studies, there's always a question as to what constitutes writing, what constitutes journalism, what constitutes communications. And many times people think in modern terms, like the 1800s perhaps, 1700s perhaps. But in my studies, that idea and concept goes back literally thousands of years. And so, I don't know if that'll be included into the collection, or maybe it will eventually. But let me show you, I'll take you through a little tour as to what I'm referring to, as to what, and we're part of this. I was taught this by elders. I mean, what I'm showing you is not other people, it's part of who we are. I teach 4 eras, and you can see that there won't be time to explain each one of them, but ancient, post-Columbian, after Columbus, 1800s, early 1900s, and the movement era. And one of the things that my students found is that, contrary to what a lot of people say, is that a lot of times people would say that, oh, the women, they were just shuffling papers or bringing the food. You know what? In the 1800s and the turn of the century, a lot of the editors were women editors and publishers. So it's not the reality, but rather the historian that created the narrative that women were not part of that history, which absolutely they were. And even if we only look at what we call the Chicano movement era, we had people like Francisca Flores, Betita Martinez. We have here Guadalupe Castillo, for example. So, and then of course even further back, some of you know Teresita Urrea. And one of my students I'm very proud of, and I think she worked on this project, Grecia Ramirez. She said that she was not only a revolutionary but a journalist in both. And the whole thing is that she was making an argument that not anybody else, I had never heard anybody else make that. She says, well, the reason she was a revolutionary outside of her writing is that she was a healer. And in the history of this continent, always healers are the ones that are put to death, and which is true if you examine your history. But in any case, anyway, that was Grecia. That was awesome. And, she, one of the newspapers has that story about Teresita. It was powerful. These are what people refer to as petroglyphs. And again, thinking that maybe it's somebody else's history? No. That's actually a version of what we call the Aztec calendar. Dr. Cecilio Orozco out of Cal State Fresno, he just recently died. That was his work. I mean, it takes too long to explain, but that's a part of what is the Aztec calendar, which coincidentally, I don't know if you know this, but during that battle of HB 2281, when they banned our history, etc., one of my colleagues, Norma Gonzalez, had the Aztec calendar, and in walked the principal and told her to take it down because it was illegal to teach the Aztec calendar. Imagine that. That's pretty shameful, but I think it's taught anyway. So again, these are representations of writing from going way back. And again, they're called tlacuilos, and if you can see in the center, that's a woman. So it isn't like, again, what we've been told, that it was just men doing things. No, it was men and women. And again, this is both Nahua and Maya culture, Maiz culture actually. And these are called amochlis, or escrituras pinturas. And one of the amazing things is, first of all, in the Teotihuacan, the Maya, the Nahua, the Mixtec, they all wrote. And I've actually even the Olmec wrote. So we have at least 3,000 years of writing, at least. And also the Quipu, and not many people know this, but most people think this is writing from the people from Peru. But the Nahua Maya peoples also had something like that, and it's called the Nepohuatzintzin. And anyway, just like the early priests that came, they thought all this was, that it was part of that it was inspired by the devil. So they burned every book they could find. And in this case, they also burned all the quipus. The quipu initially was thought to be simply like a computer, math. But what they found is that they were only reading like 15%. And what do you think the other 85% was? But history. These were books. It's just a different kind of book, a different kind of writing, a different way of storing information. But again, most of them were burned. But of course, a few survived. I just heard an incredible presentation this weekend in Phoenix. I couldn't send the photo. There was something going on with Verizon or something. But the photos that I got from this chief of the Onondaga Nation explained the wampum belts. I mean, those are codices. They're just like the quipu. There's an incredible. To us it might just look like it's like a design. No, it's a literal book and powerful. If anybody, I'm going to teach this class in the fall. And I absolutely will show his explanation of the wampum belt. It was amazing, because I already knew about the quipu and the amochlis, but not the wampum belt, not to the extent that he did. And again, this class was begun in 2009, and I think I've taught it 3 times. Whatever it is, I'm teaching it again in the fall. I even have flyers if any professors or somebody wants to pass them out. And like I said, the stigma is that, again, that what our peoples were doing was that they came from the devil. Pretty bizarre, and believe me, that's not in the past. It's still with us today. I have to remind you about Mr. Tom Horn, who thinks that what we were teaching, my colleagues were teaching, was outside of Western civilization, which is precisely what that means, that no civilization, or demonic at best. Now, this is something amazing that some of you may or may not know, but for the longest time, people thought that the Maya were the most advanced writers, and so that they kind of somewhat knew how to write, and so they spent like 100 years and they finally figured it out. Well, it turns out that what we call the Aztec or Nahua peoples also wrote, and I'm not talking like pictures, but phonetically. And so this book right here, if you ever want to see the explanation, and there's a video also, the video is called Tlacuilo. This one here is, it gives an explanation of the migration codex. And so every little thing that you see there, those are words. I mean, and the gradations, the shades, the color, it's all phonetic words. But it's actually multi-layered, so that if you don't know how to read it, you can still understand it. Very advanced and this guy, Joaquin Galarza, spent 45 years doing this. And he said he didn't crack it before. He didn't want to see it before because he wanted a scientific method. And he finally went public, not that long ago. He says it's going to take 2 generations for us to really know the history, as opposed to what we've been told by people who were guessing by looking at pictures. So all that I'm talking about right now is, again, that's pre-Columbian. But the part that a lot of people have focused on is 1800s to the 1900s. And like I said, I think the most exciting part of that, outside of that it was exile politics, revolution, fighting against Spain to be liberated and on, was the fact of the involvement of women. I think that's the highlight that my students have come out with. 1840s, as you might imagine, a lot of it had to do with human rights and land theft. That was the big topic. And I think, let me see if I have, this was a project that was being done by a group out of the Bay Area, and it was national. I think a lot of us took part in it. And that was my contribution, to include the pre-Columbian aspect of it. But all of this is related. There was the Black Liberation Movement, American Indian Movement. All that was related in the 60s, 70s. And this is just details about what I require from my students. But this is the one I wanted to show you. I don't know if you had seen that already, but that is supposed to be the first Spanish language publication in this country, and it's out of Louisiana, not Mississippi. That was the name of the river. So, of course, somebody might think that Tucson or LA or no, but it was actually Louisiana, of all places. Now, this guy here is like a hero to a lot of us, El Clamor Público. And that, if you were to read it today, you would think it was written today. His fervor about defense of rights, land theft and just human rights, incredible. And he was a young kid, like 19 years old, when he published this. And like I said, I think before my students dug up all the women, I think this is the guy I would always look up to. Now it's pretty cool that again all the women have been uncovered. Regeneración is a real special publication, and I'm going to stop in a couple seconds because I know we don't have a lot of time. But La Opinión, of course, I think it's the longest continuously published Spanish language paper. Regeneración was the Magón brothers, and it was all over the country, St. Louis, everywhere. Yeah. Of course, I won't talk too much on this because we just got an incredible history lesson on this one. So that's So Tucson's been there right from the beginning. El Coraje, again, which Lupe was part of, it was part of a group called the Chicano Press Association. And again, Coraje was right in there with them. Yeah, usually I teach 2 books. Border correspondent Ruben Salazar. So I'm sure a lot of you know who he was killed during the moratorium in 1970. And then Enriqueta Vasquez. She's one of those that I referred to as, again, Enriqueta and Betita Martinez. Way ahead of their time. They were writing, they were awesome, and they were not, doling out coffee. Anyway, all of this, if anybody wants this, you're more than welcome to have this, okay? Because I can't go through every book here. There's a lot of great resources. When I taught it, this is when we're in the heart of that battle of SB 1070 and 2281. So my students, I mean, we put together that conference, but also that Coraje. And again, you'll see one of them there. And that's the last there. I think this is Jovita on the right-hand side, Magon on the left, and I'm not sure the name of the woman on the bottom. I think it's Xochitlanese. No. Anyway, look, so thank you very much, and I'd just like to reiterate that I've been a journalist my entire life. I've been associated with writing. I was a paper boy for East LA Tribune, and then LA Herald Examiner, but I have to tell you this, that East LA Tribune, I think I was about 8 years old, I think. But that was not my first job. I used to sell tortas in Tijuana as a little kid. Thank you.
I want to just, first of all, thank a few people for who have worked so hard to put this together. I know that it was a tremendous undertaking. Mary Feeney from the U of A Libraries, thank you for working on this project and inviting me to speak tonight. Veronica Reyes, she's has such a commitment to the history of the borderlands and has worked with the School of Journalism on many different in many different ways, and we continue to collaborate. And Roberto for having the foresight to come up with this idea for this important archive that is not only going to be accessible or already accessible to historians, journalists, but the members of the general public, which is just fantastic. So this is, we all know what Tucson looks like today. This is what Tucson looked like around a few years before El Tucsonense started to be published. I thought this would be a nice way to kind of situate us in terms of what Tucson was like back then. I don't want to take too much time because I want our other esteemed guests to have a chance to speak about this important project. But I did want to mention a few things about the historical importance of this archive and also its research significance and teaching significance. So ways that researchers can use the archive, and also ways that professors like myself can use it, and actually more appropriately how their students can use the archive. So just a little bit more background on the history of Spanish language newspapers in the Southwest. They really started to take off toward the latter half of the 19th century. And Tucson really played an important role in the development of these Spanish language newspapers. There were around 10 by the end of the 19th century. And then it looks like by this map that the number of papers were reduced, but actually it seems like they moved into different parts of Arizona, so they're around the same number, still playing an important role in the development of the Southwest, but they were in different parts of Arizona. I know we got to hear some fantastic stories about the Moreno family and El Tucsonense, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about the journalism side of the newspaper, and talk about also why did newspapers increase at this particular time. Part of it was immigration that was spurred on by the Mexican Revolution, especially from 1910 through the 1920s. Both English and Spanish language newspapers helped to shape Tucson's and Tucson's collective identity of the Southwest and of northern Mexico. If, as Barbara Cloud contends, English language newspapers in the West helped to, quote, win the West, then Spanish language newspapers provided a critical and vital counterweight to Anglo hegemony in the region.
as it was mentioning, that the reason for the increase in these newspapers was the increase in immigration, and a lot of the immigrants who were coming were from Mexican middle class and upper classes, and they were able to establish these newspapers. And in fact, between 1910 and 1920, the number of Latinos in the United States who were born outside of the United States grew by almost 75%, from 2,441 to 4,261. And many of those people landed in places like Tucson and other border communities. El Tucsonense, as we know, was owned by Francisco Moreno, was the largest Spanish-language newspaper in Tucson in the early 20th century. The paper was located in the heart of Tucson at 38 South Stone Avenue, where the building is still today. According to the newspaper, it had a circulation of 1,500 people in subscribers in 1915. A monthly subscription cost readers 25 cents, or $3.72 by today's standards, and you could get a yearly subscription for $2, which would be roughly $44.68 by today's standards, adjusted for inflation. Pretty good deal. Hey, Ernesto, can I talk to you about getting a deal like that for today? No? Okay. We'll talk later. Spanish language newspapers throughout the United States flourished at this time, with as many as 218 news publications being established between 1900 and 1929. Like other Spanish language newspapers in the U.S. Southwest, El Tucsonense served two social functions, both as an activist and as a mechanism of social control. In times of cultural and ethnic contestation, papers such as El Tucsonense became symbols of the ethnic communities themselves. The editors and owners of El Tucsonense and other Spanish-language publications in Tucson were mostly middle-class and upper-class citizens, and they resisted Anglo-hegemony, but their resistance was based largely on cultural and class interests. For example, it was uncommon for them to forge alliances with working-class Mexicanos. This part of my talk is based on some of the work that Tom Sheridan has done on Los Tucsonenses. The editors of the Spanish-language newspapers opposed striking Mexican miners, evidence that they felt that unions often ignored Mexican workers, but also because of their class interests. The mining industry played an important role in the Arizona-Sonora borderlands economy, and strikes halted economic development. At the same time, El Tucsonense denounced discriminatory labor practices and harsh treatment of Mexican farm laborers. Located on the northern side of the U.S.-Mexico border, Spanish-language newspapers also provided a different perspective than those publications in Mexico, which by and large sided with certain political factions. For example, Sonoran Governor Maitorena owned La Voz de Sonora and La Libertad, two newspapers that he used to promote his own interests. The safe haven that the U.S. side of the border provided for Mexican journalists was also evident in other parts of the borderlands, most notably in El Paso, where as many as 40 Spanish-language newspapers were printed between 1890 and 1925. One of the most famous publications was El Ahuizote, published by Ricardo Flores Magón. By the early 20th century, Tucson was a relatively vibrant news town, with as many as 43 small to medium newspapers in print between 1910 and 1920, and at least 11, or close to 1/4 of them, were published in Spanish. Can you imagine that many papers in Tucson today? We have a lot more students, I think, but anyway. Let me talk now a little bit about the research significance of and how I, have used this archive, and maybe how others can use it as well. For example, we spoke about the Mexican Revolution. These newspaper articles in the newspapers are just packed full of information that would be very useful to find out how the editors and reporters were portraying the different factions that participated in the Mexican Revolution. Just if anybody's interested in looking at the archive itself, it's really fairly easy to use. I, for example, have searched through articles by just using search terms like revolution or frontera. It's pretty easy, and numerous articles popped up by using search terms like those. Also, if historians are interested or students are interested in questions of ethnic portrayals of ethnic groups, you could use these newspapers to look at how, for example, the newspapers in El Tucsonense and the Tucson Citizen, which is also accessible in the University of Arizona Library, to see how maybe they portrayed Chinese during the time of the Mexican Revolution. If you know Mexican history and U.S. history, the Chinese were also very much targeted and suffered discrimination. In terms of, so that's some of the comparative research. Also, transnational research is very important to understanding this region in itself. The Arizona-Sonora borderlands is really connected. Yes, we have this militarized zone today, but we're very much connected in terms of our culture, in terms of the economy, and looking at both sides of the border in terms of news production back in the early 20th century, we can see some phenomenon in how the region developed, and this is an emerging area of research that is very important. Okay, just to talk briefly about how I have used this archive and how I hope to maybe use it in the future. This past fall, I taught a course called Reporting in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, and we looked a lot at the history of immigration in this region, and one of the exercises that I had my students do was to use the archive and pull an article that had to do with immigration, for example, or a particular part related to immigration from a newspaper in the United States, an English language newspaper, and a Spanish language newspaper. And in the 1950s, or I left that up to them. And what they were able to find was very much, I think, very valuable for them. They liked that activity, and so I plan to do more things like that. The other thing is, in our journalism education, we really try to tell our students and aspiring journalists that they need to report with context, and part of that context is historical context. So they can look up the history of how people reported on various subjects, including arms smuggling from the United States into Mexico during the time of the Mexican Revolution, something that we still hear about today. Immigration, I've already mentioned that. Also, we've worked with UA Special Collections in Veronica Reyes, where we've had students come down they actually come down to the library, physically sit in here, and listen to Veronica's expertise on how to access some of these important records and how we explain how they can include those documents, whether it's photographs or manuscripts, into a television news report, for example, something that is sorely lacking in some of the television news that we see today. And then finally, I just want to mention that teaching in the Mexican context, I will have the opportunity to be a visiting professor in Mexico next year, and I'm excited to see and explore ways that I will be able to have students look at these historic newspapers. One of the classes I'm going to be teaching will be how the United States reports on Mexico. So as a historian and a journalist, I will love to see them take a look at some of these earlier archives and some of the ones from the 1960s. I think it'll be a tremendous learning experience for them. And finally, I just want to say muchas felicidades, congratulations. This is such a wonderful project. I know it was a lot of hard work, and it's going to be fantastic for our students and researchers and the public.
Okay, can everyone hear me? It's stated in the program that I was co-editor of El Coraje. In fact, as I looked over the Chicano newspaper during the period of the 1960s and 70s, there were no editors or co-editors. Everybody participated. It was collective. And part of El Coraje was out of the Chicano house on the west side, and many of us were students at the university at the time. At the time I was a graduate student. And El Coraje was part of the civil rights movement for Chicanos, and newspapers were part of all of that civil rights movements everywhere. And as I was looking through my collection of newspapers from that period, you can see, for example, the John Brown Party here in Tucson had a newspaper. The Mexican American Yaqui organization, or Mayo, had a newspaper. Coraje was part of that as well. And the list of newspapers throughout the United States that was part of the civil rights upheavals that were going on in the 1960s and 70s. So that El Coraje was part of that experience. I saw earlier here Frank de la Cruz, who was part of that. Frank, are you still here? Oh, Frank de la Cruz. Anybody else here from the Chicano house, please stand up. And from that period where all of us were writing. Why a newspaper? It was at that time, it's very hard for people today, except for those of us who were back then, to understand how to live in a world without technology. We couldn't even afford at the Chicano house to have a telephone. Or we would have a telephone and the service would be off and on. We would mimeograph our flyers to put out. And this was also part of what was going on at the university. Literally, the university could be closed overnight by just leafleting, and boycotting and occupying the main part of the, Old Main and so forth. So El Coraje was then formed to join in this social movement that was going on throughout the United States and here in Tucson. Now, I think it's very important for us, as Roberto and Celeste were talking about living in a border region, that as we were going through this, and as I like to say to history students, when we are in this region here, we have to kind of change the narrative. The narrative of U.S. history is kind of a movement from the east to the west. So people think of ourselves as being in the west, in the southwest, in the Rocky Mountain region. And yet, for those of us who are native to this region, okay, we are in the north, right? And so the north, so we reconfigure ourselves into that narrative, right? And El Coraje was part of reconfiguring that sense of ourselves, so that many of these Chicano newspapers, like El Coraje, had certain characteristics. First, they were radical. And it wasn't just standing around and being against things, but more importantly, it was to stand for a systematic social change that was based on concrete evidence from the communities producing that evidence, that it was community-based evidence. I remember in the walkouts in 1968 and 69 that kids would sit and go through all of the yearbooks saying, okay, this kid came in as a freshman. Did they follow through all those 4 years? So that when they went before Tucson Unified, at that time, District 1, they had evidence. This is what the rate of dropouts are. This is what is going on within the educational system. So that it was a community-based research. We were questioning the models that were being used within the academic world. I myself, as a history graduate student, went to one of my history professors and said, well, I like to do my research for my master's on Mexican Americans and their involvement in the revolution. He said there is no such history because there is no bibliography, right? There is no archival. In other words, we didn't exist, right? And so that was the sense then of where we had to begin in terms of when we talked about a radical newspaper, we were looking at systemic changes, not just simply a reformist approach to things. Okay, we'll give you this class or that class. No, we want a whole department, right, that is going to produce our intellectual work. And then, so the newspapers were radical. They were also nationalistic. Now, when I talk about nationalistic, I'm not talking based on an ethnic or racial superiority, but really centered in a historical, cultural identity of a people in a landscape, right? That was a reality for those of us of the borderlands. In one of the newspapers, I remember a poem that a young man wrote, and very young, he was like 10, 12 years, and he began by saying, "My father was not George Washington." No, and it wasn't like a rejection, as he goes on in the poem, of the United States, but an affirmation of a greater sense of what it was to be an American. That America was not just simply the United States, but America was all of us of a continent. And so it was that sense then that was conveyed in these newspapers that was very important, and that young people, 10 years old, could write. Newspapers have always been very core in la cultura mexicana. The public intellectuals, everybody writes. I mean, we all know the great newspapers and magazines of Mexico and all of them that were mentioned here of the United States. Everybody could write and give perspective and write poetry and write ideas as well. And so that nationalistic approach had to do with an attempt to incorporate the sense of who we were. Also, the other characteristic of these newspapers in the 60s and 70s was that they were barrio-centered. Okay? They were a counter to what I would call el criollismo, a sense of elitism of what it means to be a Mexicano. Right? To be a Mexicano, to be of an upper class, to speak in a certain way. Right? Sort of like if we were to look at that, a class distinction. And here what we were celebrating was el barrio. Ultimately what Luis Valdés called el rascuachismo, right? El chicanismo. In other words, the working class ethos exemplified by a great Cantinflas, Tintan, you know, Teatro Campesino, Teatro Libertad. I mean, all of these great triatos that were bringing the richness of the language that was being created in the streets. After all, language is not created in the dictionary. It comes from the streets into the dictionary. And this is what these writers and thinkers were doing at that time with the experience of being part of the barrio, the language of the barrio. Not, we would say, you talk the way you talk. Don't be embarrassed to have to please anyone, right? This is what we are going to speak in the way that we speak in the barrio. And so this would be expressed not only in language, but also the way people dressed, the values, the customs, the music. The richness of the music is, if you have to think, that has emerged out of the barrios. I mean, to you know, we can think of all the East LA música that came out of East LA, the Música of the Valle in Texas, here in Tucson, where we had a person who was writing barrio music, right? And so we then have that in the newspapers as well. Not to separate our people by class, but to be celebrate who we are in a totality as well. And also, the other characteristic of these newspapers was to be very culturally creative. We have artists, and you can see, for example, in El Coraje, some of the artists, some of the art that is being created, and certainly out of that is going to emerge the renacimiento of Chicanismo on the walls, because one of the things that was very important was to create a community space for art, that art should be outside of the museums, that art belonged to all of the people, and we were all artists, and we could express it. If it was the señoras who were crocheting or doing whatever they were doing in there, that was art. That wasn't a craft, right? That we elevate ourselves in all areas. And so you had lots of poets. If you look at El Coraje, you'll see poetry by not only Salomón Valdenegro, but our Congressman Raúl Grijalva. I don't know how great a poet he was, but he was writing poetry at the time for El Coraje, and so forth. So the poetry, and then out of that came the storytellers, people like Silviana Wood. Some of you remember her philosopher from the barrio, Doña Chona, that was on TV for many, many years, and expressing that great sense of Cantinflas' attitude of how to look at life. And that was expressed. And then women, and Roberto was talking about the women. And yes, the women were not just simply serving. The women were very much at the center of the work that was being done at the time. Some of the women who were proposing the tactics and strategies and so forth that would create the Chicano movement, certainly Enriqueta that you mentioned, and Betita Martinez, and many, many others. I mean, we could just go on. And it was just an enormous, and in some of the newspapers you begin to see, often that aspect of the newspapers are not looked at, but what women were talking about, sterilization programs that were, trusted and, were within the minority communities at the time. There were stories that were not written about, that were written about in the newspapers as well, internationally as well. It was very characteristic to be talking about what were going on. What happened in Mexico in 1968 was all over the newspapers. For example, when Rubén Salazar was assassinated, was murdered in 1970 during the moratorium, the next few days we had La Raza, the newspaper, with the photos that were taken directly on the scene. The New York Times didn't have that. The testimony of people who were there. He was murdered, right? And others were hesitant. If you were a mainstream reporter, you wouldn't say he was murdered, but he was murdered. And we had that in La Raza right away, right? To close, I mean, the whole concept then of all of these newspapers that have been digitized is very important for students to see them in the great wide perspective of what they represent. And in 1970, and internationally, let me just add something very important here. Not only what was going on in Mexico, but already in the Chicano newspapers, you knew interviews from Vietnam, you had Cuba, you had Algiers, you had Chile. Before there was a word about Chile in the mainstream newspapers. I mean, because many of these Chicano activists would go there, right? And like a young woman who got arrested in Argentina and was tortured, you know, and so forth, and issues that were very important internationally at the time that were not being written about, right? So speaking about the Venceremos brigades and so forth. In 1970, Herminio Rios, who was a graduate student here at the university and an activist at the Chicano House, and also was one of the co-founders of El Grito, an editor of El Grito, which was a very fundamental journal that was started by Herminio Rios. And he and I wrote an article that was published, and it was called Towards a True Chicano Bibliography, Mexican-American Newspapers, 1848 to 1942. And that was written in 1970, and we listed all of these newspapers. And it was a way to show in a very small, humble way that yes, we existed, and yes, we had an archive. Because you do not know about it doesn't mean it does not exist. Because you do not see us does not mean that we do not exist. Right? So the Chicano newspapers, like El Coraje, were, you know, forcefully bringing those perspectives to the greater experience of the United States, and were part of that great civil rights movements that were going on. And there wasn't any movement, as I said, looking through all of these newspapers that I have, beginning with the Black Panther newspaper and going on to the Young Lords and so forth. All of the newspapers, the women's newspapers, liberation movements of all sorts, all of these newspapers were there, and with very fundamental information that could only be communicated in this way at that time, right? Because there was no, like, you know, internet. So it had to be communicated in other ways. And certainly the posters for the music, the cultural changes that occurred, very fundamental was the writing that was going around all of this that was happening at that time. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our speakers. You all had very amazing presentations. And now I'd like to open it up for questions.
I just wanted to say that in Tucsonense, you know, you all talked about it covering the revolution, covering international issues. Well, I found my grandfather's obituary on the front page. I also found my grandmother's obituary. I found my mother's photo on the front page. It covered the community. It was a way of keeping the community together. The language, the Spanish language, helped us preserve our culture. In fact, on the corner of the newspaper, there was a little saying that says, you know, if you lose your language, you lose your identity, you lose who you are. And so I think the paper served a much more important purpose in that it provided a sense of cohesion amongst the people in Tucson.
Thank you. In the back.
I'm curious about the budget of the project and where did the money come from? Where did the funding come from?
The project went on for several years. I don't know off the top of my head how much it cost. But the funding, the library has a fund internally for this type of project, and so the library completely funded the project. Yes, go ahead.
I grew up with Tucsonense in the house along with the Arizona Daily Star, and I also want to make note of the University of Arizona Journalism Department, now Journalism School, publication El Independiente, which early on recognized the need to publish South Tucson, kind of what we now call hyper-local. So it covered an area that was not being covered, and also get university students an opportunity to receive training in journalism. But my specific question is, I'm just curious, so is this the first time that El Tucsonense and some of these other publications are first made available online?
Yes, there's a commercial database called Hispanic American Newspapers, and El Tucsonense is in there from 1915 to 1923. But we started in our archive, El Tucsonense, we have from 1924 up through 1959. But, you know, a lot of the other newspapers, they're not available anyplace else. Yes?
As a community person, then what do you do to access the newspapers?
There's
the technical part of it. What do you
just through the internet. There's a web address. I think on the program in the back, it provides the web address, and it's just free and open to anybody.
And you can go back as far as the newspaper starts.
Yes. Oh, for El Tucsonense? We have El Tucsonense from 1924, starting in 1924. We decided, since it was available in this other database, not to go back to 1915. Yes, Patty?
When we were at the Arizona State Museum, there was we went into the basement, or maybe it was the Historical Society, and they have the Tucsonense. And are those included is there any collaboration with the Historical Society on digitizing the newspapers that they have in their basement?
We decided to start with the project that we mostly digitized what we had at the U of A library. Dr. Rodriguez provided the two magazines, America's 2001 and Corazon de Aztlan. We also collaborated with the State Library. It was the first newspaper that they were, Spanish language newspaper that they were digitizing, El Fronterizo. And they, I think, actually got the print from the Historical Society. But we've talked about if there is another phase, we would definitely want to work with them. Yes?
I have a question for Ms. Bustamante. Your presentation was quite interesting, and you are not only a professor but a student also, and you're always asking questions. I have a question. Why do you think El Tucsonense died in 1960?
Wow.
I've been asked that question by 100 people, time and again.
Repeat the
question. The question was, why do I think El Tucsonense died in 1960? Which is a hard question for me to answer, given I have not looked specifically at that question. I would have to say what was going on in Tucson at that particular time. What other Spanish language newspapers? I think there was the Alianza Cívica that was being published at that particular time. I'm not sure. I would maybe look at competition. What was why readership or interest in the newspaper at that particular time declined. Perhaps it was the increase in other Spanish language newspapers, some of the larger ones, the regional papers, coming out of Los Angeles or San Antonio. Maybe some of these larger papers. Maybe readers thought that those were more relevant to them, but that's sort of like just off the top of my head. It's a fascinating question. Maybe it's something that I should take, a closer look at.
Yeah.
It's not working.
I always look at the questions also, and I would ask the question in a different way, and that is, why cannot it exist now? That's the question I would ask. Can it exist now? And I think in the history of publishing, if there's a need, it'll happen. And I think, I would be one to answer that there is an absolute need for it. And again, I don't know if that's going to be satisfactory to you, but in my mind, I see that as very necessary. I want to add 2 little quick stories, and then maybe you might want to comment again. Because what I forgot to do is one thing real quick about Lupe. I didn't tell you that when she got arrested, did anybody know why she got arrested? Because she read a letter from Birmingham, Martin Luther King. The second story I wanted to give you, because this is kind of like a little bonus, because I just received this very recently, and that is, some of you probably remember that the little kids from Wakefield Middle School walked out, and they were banned from their own school for 9 days. When their teacher told me about this, I said, ask the parents. If they get permission, send them over. I'll teach them. I'll teach them at my school. At my classes here at the university. For that, there's been an attempt to fire me for about the last 2 years. Things about that and related. So here's the good news about that. I got a call and a message by email not too long ago, telling me that for the precise same reason I'm getting the National Human Rights Award this Sunday.
I would also suggest something that was happening was the proliferation and the beginning of Radio Mexicanos. Okay, and because I saw el señor Portillo, who is here and who is very clave in use, because his, he would open his radio. I remember many times, many of us going early in the morning to the radio station and just talking about what was going on in Tucson. And so that was that's an area that has been highly neglected, was the role and the importance of the radios, right? Beginning with Señor Orozco, Jacinto Orozco, and every morning when I think Bob Diaz was talking about the newspapers had a lot of information about the community, and Jacinto Orozco would always begin his programs by talking about who had died, what the wakes were that night, where they were going to be, and then anniversaries. Oh, this is 2 years since so-and-so has died, so there's going to be all of that kind of communication. I mean, everybody woke up to Don Jacinto Orozco. And what was his theme song? Was El Corrido de Zacatecas. Yeah. Yeah, and so I think that's an important role, and I don't know if Señor Portillo is still here or not, pero que se pare, por favor. I think we should acknowledge the role that they played as well.
I just want to step in here and acknowledge everybody we're starting to lose our audience, so I think it's time for us to feed our bellies. We've been feeding our hearts and our brains, and so I really would like for us to start stepping out to the reception, and there's plenty of time there then to continue to ask questions and tell our stories. Chris just has a few words to say about the UA Press in just a second, but I do want to acknowledge all of you who have been here from far away. Frank Sotomayor, Dr. Benton, others in the Moreno and Elias family who've traveled from California and other states. So please know that it hasn't gone unseen, and thank you again. And here's Chris just to say a few words about the UA Press.
The University of Arizona Press's longstanding tradition of publishing excellence has examined important, gritty, and powerful stories of the borderlands for more than 50 years. From Patricia Preciado Martin's portrayal of family life to Lydia Otero's history of Tucson's Latino community, from Rodolfo Acuña's exploration of migration to Oscar Martinez's definitive history of the border, our authors and their books have long been informed by journalists and reporting from the border, such as those now available through the Historic Mexican and Mexican-American Press collection. The press has a selection of books available for display just right outside in the exhibition room. Catherine Conrad, who is director of the U of A Press, will be available to answer any questions at the reception. So please join us at the reception. Thank you.